Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. We're over halfway through 2025, so I think it's time to do a roundup of my favorite handhelds so far this year. Now compared to 2024, so far this year we have not had a ton of releases, but some really good ones. So in this video I'm going to break them down into 5 different categories and talk about my favorites for each of them and a couple runners up as well. And so without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, for my first category, we're going to talk about my favorite budget option. This means something that usually is going to be $60 or less. And for this category, my favorite choice is an easy one. This is the Battle XP G350. Now, that kind of sounds like a no-name brand, but this is actually made by Anbernic, at least we suspect so, because it's got the exact same look and feel as a lot of other Anbernic handhelds. But the nice thing about this one is that it comes in really cheap. It is around $35 depending on where you find it, which I think is a steal for everything that you get. We've got a 3.5-inch 480p resolution display, really good controls, 2 analog sticks, and pretty good sound as well, even though it is a single bottom-firing mono speaker. It also uses the tried and true RK3326 chipset, which has been around for years at this point and in dozens of other handhelds. Now, that might just seem like more of the same, but it's actually a really good thing when it comes to these cheap handhelds. That means that things like custom firmware and optimizations for the emulators are going to be present on this one as well. And so for $35, this is surprisingly mature in terms of the software experience as well as the games that can run on it. You'll be able to play everything up through PS1 and then a good amount of other systems, like PSP and Dreamcast and so on. The only main limitations of the G350 are the fact that it doesn't have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or HDMI out, which are some of my favorite features in these cheaper handhelds. And if you are looking to get those features, another good budget pick is this one right here, called the Anbernic RG35XX Pro. It probably looks strikingly familiar to what we were just looking at. And that's because, in essence, this is the same handheld. It's got the same controls, the same bottom-firing mono speaker. It looks identical to the G350. The big difference here is that this one is using the H700 chipset, which is very similar to the Rockchip 3326, but this one also has things like HDMI out, as well as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And because it's an Anbernic XX handheld, that means that all the custom firmware that have been made for the other dozen handhelds with the same chipset is going to be available here as well. Now this one's about $15 more than the one that doesn't have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, but I think that's a pretty fair trade-off if you do want to have those additional features. And so the way I see it, if you were looking for a handheld that was made this year that is not going to break the bank, these two are your most solid options. But it's also worth noting that sometimes the best budget device that you can find in 2025 is something that was released earlier, because these will often be on sale. And so if you are looking at something as like a first introductory handheld, it is worth looking at something that's a little bit older. Some quick choices would be the Anbernic RG35XX Plus as well as the 35XXH, same chipset, same screen and everything, so this is going to be very similar to the one we were just looking at. Other great options would be the Neo Mini Plus and the Trim UI Brick, and all of these can be found between like $40 and $60 depending on where you're shopping. I will leave links to my reviews to all of these down below. Okay, next up we have what I'm calling my favorite micro machine. These are going to be micro handhelds, one of my favorite genres of this space altogether. There haven't been a ton of micro releases so far this year, but this is my runner-up. It's called the Magic X Mini 028. This one has a 2.8-inch screen and is a nice pocketable size, and the thing that sets it apart is the fact that it actually runs Android. And it is pretty neat to have something so small that you can load up with like Android games and of course emulation as well. But the thing that keeps me from making this my favorite choice is the fact that it doesn't have a touchscreen, which is kind of necessary with Android. So I often find myself frustrated with the overall user experience with this little guy, even though I do think it is pretty charming. My overall pick when it comes to micro handhelds this year is the GKD Pixel 2. This is what I would consider to be an everyday carry type of handheld. It is only 2.4 inches in overall screen size, and it's made out of metal, so it feels very rugged. And so this thing is so small that you can easily throw it into your pocket, and it makes it really fun for gaming on the go. The 2.4-inch screen is surprisingly crisp. It is a 480p resolution, and it's also using that same Rockchip RK3326 chip that we saw in the previous recommendation in the budget category. And so this handheld will play all your favorite classic systems and a couple of the more modern ones as well. Now, because of the metal shell, it is a bit more expensive. It's about $75, but I still think it is really neat and very rugged. I would recommend getting a screen protector for the front though. It also has surprisingly tight controls, although due to its smaller form factor, I wouldn't say it's super comfortable for long gameplay sessions. Instead, this is more for a pick up and play experience. Like with all these devices, I'll leave my review link down below and also a link to that screen protector because I do think it is an important factor of really being able to enjoy this on the go. Alright, our next category is going to be my favorite Game Boy. So this specifically is going to be a handheld that will fill you with that same nostalgia of using something that's a little bit more old school. Now, the phrase Game Boy might evoke a certain feeling in you, depending on which system you're most familiar with. And specifically, if you start to think about a Game Boy Advance, we've got two great options that have released so far this year. The first is the RG34XX. This thing looks almost like a dead ringer of the original Game Boy Advance. It's got a couple extra buttons like L2 and R2. It also has HDMI out and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And the big star of the show is its screen. It's 3.4 inches and a perfect 3x integer scale of the Game Boy Advance. Now, this screen aspect ratio and size don't make it a perfect match for other systems besides Game Boy Advance, but if you're specifically looking for something like a more modern GBA, this is a really easy option. And because this falls in the same Anbernic RGXX line, it's going to have the same chipset that we've been talking about previously and all the custom firmware options within it. It's also going to cost about $60 and will play up through PS1 and then a smattering of those other systems as well. Now, if you prefer a more clamshell form factor, there's also a GBA SP clone as well. This one is called the Anbernic RG34XX SP. And for all intents and purposes, this is exactly the same as the other RG34XX device, but with that SP form factor. It's got the same screen and also has the same chipset and performance. And again, this is going to be a pitch-perfect GBA experience. Even the clicky face buttons and D-pad are very reminiscent of the original console. The size of the handheld is almost a dead ringer for the Game Boy Advance SP as well, so it fits almost exactly the same in your pocket. Now, there are a couple weird aspects to this handheld, including the fact that the screen position is not perfectly centered, which kind of drives me nuts, and then it also has dual analog sticks, which are not really necessary for Game Boy Advance gameplay. But I think that all things considered, if you are looking for a GBA-like device, we've got two great options. But for me personally, my top choice when it comes to a Game Boy handheld is this thing. This is the Retroid Pocket Classic. There are a couple different model options available from the website depending on the amount of RAM and storage you want, and the price ranges from $100 to $130 before shipping. And I think they did a really good job capturing just the overall fun and form factor of the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Not only that, this thing packs quite a punch. It's got a 4-inch OLED panel with a resolution of 1240 by 1080. The aspect ratio is also very fitting for a lot of classic games. It's 31 by 27, which actually makes it look really good when it comes to playing things like Game Boy Color, even Game Boy Advance looks really good here, even though it does have black bars at the top and bottom. The chip on this is also surprisingly powerful. It is the Snapdragon G1 Gen 2. And even though this is a budget streaming-minded chipset, it actually performs really well in emulation, to the point where you can play a lot of PS2 and GameCube games. There are only two major things that hold this back from being one of my favorite handhelds of all time. Number one is the fact that it lacks an analog stick, which can make it harder to play some of those high-end systems, but is also a catch-22 because it makes it great for classic gaming too. And the other missing feature is that this chipset does not support video out, which is a real big bummer because I think this would be a really great option to be able to consoleize. Hook it up with a Bluetooth controller and you don't even have to worry about analog sticks at that point. But sadly, yeah, no video out on this one. So instead, I like to think about this handheld as a Game Boy, like a really classic handheld that can also play some higher end systems if you would like to. And so this has become one of my favorite ways to play original Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, even Super Nintendo and Nintendo run awesome on this as well. There's also a 6-button variant, which is really great if you want to focus on things like arcade-style fighters or the Sega catalog. And this chipset does have enough juice to play all the way up to Sega Saturn, so I think that's a really excellent fit as well. And so when you put this all together, I think that the Retroid Pocket Classic is one of the best Game Boys we have seen in a long time. This beautiful OLED display, the wonderful color options that we have, and the options to be able to play some higher end systems as well, all in a pretty affordable package. Okay, so next up we have what I'm calling my favorite endgame handheld. Now this is kind of a very specific niche as well. So there's a couple things with this. Number one is that I'm talking about high-end devices, those that you can play and enjoy for years to come without thinking that, oh man, I need to buy the latest and greatest. And number two, the word endgame is very subjective and also a moving target. And so I don't actually think these are endgame devices, but they are on the higher end. So if you want the best of the best, here are my top choices. My first runner-up is this one, the Ayaneo Pocket Evo. Now, this one came out late 2024, early 2025, and it has a lot of good things going for it. Number one, it has full-size triggers as well as full-size analog sticks, which is very rare in Android-based handhelds. It's also surprisingly comfortable with these nice ergonomic grips on it, and so I really do enjoy playing on this handheld. This thing also has power for days. You're going to be able to emulate everything you can on Android and also play just about every Android-based game as well. But there are two things that keep this from being my number one choice. Number one is the price point. It starts at $460 and goes over $700 at the highest spec model. So this is very expensive, even for what you're getting. And the second point is that the software as well as the audio quality on this leave a lot to be desired. And I think that if you are paying that much for a handheld, it shouldn't have that many shortcomings. Either way, there are people who really love their Ayaneo Pocket Evo, and so I did want to give it an honorable mention because it is a fantastic handheld, all things considered. Another handheld worth mentioning is the Lenovo Legion Go S. This is a handheld PC, so it's going to be running either SteamOS or Windows, depending on the option that you get. And I just recently did a video about the SteamOS variant, and I was really impressed with it. Now, I only had this device on loan, so I had to send it back to the company, but man, ever since making that video, I've kind of been missing it. And so I think that does say a lot about how good this handheld really is, but I'm holding off on buying it until we see some more handheld PC options coming later this year. For now, my favorite endgame handheld is this one, the AYN Odin 2 Portal. This is also not a cheap handheld. It starts at $330, but I think that the $400 Pro model, like this one here, is my favorite choice. And this thing basically has it all when it comes to Android handhelds. It's running the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. It's got a 1080p 7-inch screen that is AMOLED as well as 120 Hz. And that combination of power and screen opens up a whole world when it comes to gameplay. For starters, you'll be able to play basically every GameCube and PS2 game you can think of at upscaled resolutions, and because we have that additional power, you can do things like use custom textures and mods and so on. It's also a very capable Nintendo Switch emulation handheld as well. In fact, you can play most games in docked mode as long as they're compatible with whatever emulator you're trying to use. And so it often feels like a full-on Nintendo Switch OLED, but upscaled to a docked mode 1080p. However, one of my main use cases for the Odin 2 Portal happens to be local game streaming as well as cloud streaming. The device comes with Wi-Fi 7, giving me a very fast connection and low latency. In fact, my average decoding time when streaming from my local PC is about 6 milliseconds, and also bear in mind that I'm streaming this at 120 frames per second. It's also really good when it comes to cloud streaming, like with NVIDIA GeForce Now, which has the option to stream at 120 frames per second and 1080p, so it's a perfect match for this display. And when combined with its 8,000 milliamp hour battery, we're talking about the ability to stream somewhere between 10 and 12 hours at a time. It is amazing. Now, there are a couple shortcomings to this handheld as well. Number one is that out of the box, it comes with some pretty small analog sticks, but you can easily change them out for either additional ones from AYN themselves or 3D printed options. I've been using these ones right here. I will leave them linked down below. They're from a newer shop. And so it might cost a little bit more to upgrade your analog sticks, but since making the switch, I've had no complaints. Another factor worth considering is that I think that out of the box, the ergonomics are a little bit flat. And so I found that using the official AYN grip case like this, which I think only costs like $15, is well worth it. This little grip case completely transforms the ergonomics and makes it a lot easier to use for me. And so I've really enjoyed this setup right here. At this point, the only thing that could be better on the Odin 2 Portal are these face buttons. I think they are just a little bit too loud and clacky for my tastes, but I think it's a minor complaint, all things considered, in a device that can practically play anything. And so if you're looking for a very powerful and impressive emulation and streaming focused handheld, I think the Odin 2 Portal is an easy choice. Now, before we jump into my final category of favorite overall handheld, I've got one other small category that I want to talk about. I'm calling this one Not Quite There Yet. So the idea here is that these are handhelds where you can obviously see the company tried, but didn't quite hit the mark. And so I would give these handhelds an A for effort, but something less when it comes to actual execution. My first example is going to be the Mio Flip, and this has almost everything I would want in a smaller clamshell handheld. It's almost the exact same size as the original Game Boy Advance SP, and it has a lot of bells and whistles, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, HDMI out. It's also got a pretty powerful CPU, the RK3566, which is a little bit more powerful than the other handhelds in the same form factor. It also has my favorite controls of any of the Game Boy Advance SP clones. They are super light to the touch and just a pleasure to use. And even though they're not the best, it does have 2 analog sticks in case you need them for certain games like Nintendo 64. But the main thing that holds this device back is its hinge. It has been prone to breaking, especially on certain color models like the gray option. In fact, I did a video myself because I had one of my devices break on me, and so it's been very hard to recommend this device even though I think it's almost perfect in all other respects. So I'm hoping that Mio will take another stab and try to upgrade its hinge in the future, because this would make it the ultimate small clamshell handheld for me, but it's not quite there yet. Now, another A for effort handheld is the Magic X040. Now, all they really did is just took a regular screen and then rotated it so that it's vertical. But it does open up some gaming options for some underrepresented systems like Nintendo DS, as well as vertical arcade games. Now, I recently did a video about this, and my main complaint about it was that the screen just felt a little bit too small. When playing DS games, it's actually smaller than any DS screen that was ever released. So it does feel a bit like a degraded option when compared to the original console, and I think that that's probably the thing that's holding this device back the most. But all the same, I love the fact that the company made this handheld in the first place, and it shows that sometimes it's worth taking a risk, because this is a really ingenious design. I just wish the screen was a little bit bigger. And then finally, one other handheld that I'm super glad was actually released, but is not one that is easy to recommend, is this thing. This is the Anbernic RG Slide, and it kind of feels and looks like an older slide phone from back in the day. And admittedly, this thing is a lot of fun. All you have to do is just slide it up and it'll expose the controls, and you can just start playing like this. It's an Android-based handheld, but yeah, a really cool feature. It's also got a really impressive screen. It is 4.7 inches 4:3 aspect ratio and a resolution of 1280 by 960 and a refresh rate of 120 Hz. And so overall, I find this to be one of the most ingenious handhelds I've seen so far this year. I love the fact that it just feels so unique compared to everything else. However, the sum of all of its parts are not quite there for me. It's using the T820 chipset, which is a little bit older. We saw that with some Anbernic releases last year, but I do wish that it was a little bit beefier. It's also a lot more expensive than the other T820 handhelds. It's $190, and so that combination to me feels a little bit too high. And then finally, the other aspect that keeps this from being one of my favorite handhelds is that it is quite heavy and bulky. This thing is a lot thicker than you may think, even just seeing it here on video. Even though it looks a lot like the PSP Go, it's like 3 times larger than this thing, and so it kind of feels like it ate several of them for lunch. So in the end, I love that Anbernic made this handheld in the first place. I think it was a very bold choice, considering the fact that many handhelds just seem to look the same. But when it comes down to it, it still feels like a first-gen product, and I can't wait to see what they come up with this form factor next. And so finally, at long last, we are at my favorite overall handheld category. And I always love narrowing it down to this category, but it was especially hard so far this year. I ended up coming up with 2 options. So the first is kind of like an in-between handheld. This is the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2. The original released late last year, but it came with a lot of screen-related issues. I made some videos about it previously, but at the end of the day, they ended up shipping it with a new version 2 and with a new screen. Everything else about this device is the same. It has the Snapdragon 865, which we saw in the Retroid Pocket 5, but this time around it has the same screen as the Retroid Pocket Classic that we were talking about earlier. That was my favorite Game Boy, if you remember that one. So this one has that same AMOLED 1240 by 1080 resolution screen, and it looks gorgeous on this little form factor. In addition, this one is horizontal, which makes it a bit more comfortable to hold than the Retroid Pocket Classic, and it also has dual analog sticks, which makes it a really good fit for other systems like GameCube and PS2. And what I love most about the Retroid Pocket Mini is that it's a really good fit for a number of different systems. games. Because we have that squarish aspect ratio, that means things like Game Boy and Game Boy Color are going to look just as amazing here as they did on the Classic. And I think that Game Boy Advance games look especially good here as well. Even some of your classic systems like Nintendo and Super Nintendo look really good here too if you blow them up to an 8:7 aspect ratio. In fact, you can use integer scaling overscale to make them a perfect fit. And personally, even with 4:3 systems, I still end up stretching them out to fill up the whole screen because the screen to body ratio on this handheld is fantastic. So even though it is a smaller handheld, it feels like you're playing on something much bigger. And so this has been one of my favorite travel-friendly handhelds that can play all the way up to GameCube and PS2, but in a very small form factor. In fact, every trip I've gone on so far this year, this has been my main handheld that I've taken with me. So it is a bit of a cheat just because the original Retroid Pocket Mini came out last year, but I honestly didn't fall in love with it until we got the version 2 in this new screen, which came out in 2025. And finally, my favorite overall handheld pick so far this year is going to be the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. Now, this thing is a clamshell form factor, but almost identical to the Retroid Pocket 5, which was one of my favorites of last year. This thing has the same 5.5-inch AMOLED 1080p display as the Retroid Pocket 5, and the same Snapdragon 865 that we have in the RP5 and the Retroid Pocket Mini. But in having to choose between the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Flip 2, I've been picking the Flip 2 every single time. A lot of it comes down to the clamshell form factor and the fact that, I can just close it up and protect the screen and everything else and then chuck it in my bag. I love that overall experience. I also think that the controls are surprisingly comfortable. Even playing D-pad centric stuff like Game Boy Advance feels very good because the buttons are fairly inboard, which makes them not a long stretch for your thumbs. And so I have found that playing classic systems all the way up through like PSP, anything that's D-pad centric, is also very comfortable. And dual analog stick gameplay is not that bad either because the analog sticks are up top, which means there's not a lot of distance between your thumbs and your fingers that are using the shoulders and triggers. And so surprisingly, I found this more comfortable with FPS games than the Retroid Pocket 5 out of the box. And I think the Snapdragon 865 is a perfect fit for these mid-tier style handhelds. The prices for these range anywhere from $200 for the Retroid Pocket Mini to $230 for the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. And even though it's an older chip, it's still checks out. We've got performance to be able to play things like PS2 and GameCube upscaled to about a 2 or a 2.5x resolution. And because we're using Adreno drivers in this Qualcomm chip, that means we can use special turn-up drivers available on the internet, which will increase compatibility for some systems like Nintendo Switch and Wii U. Not only that, the Snapdragon 865 can dual boot into Linux, which will expand your possibilities as well. I've got videos about all this stuff here on this channel. So long story short, the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 for me so far this year has been the complete package. It doesn't break the bank at $230 and has a powerful chipset that can play just about everything you can play on Android with a couple caveats. It's also got a beautiful display, decent controls, and this clamshell form factor make it feel very console-like, which is one of my favorite aspects of this handheld altogether. So there we go, those are my favorite choices of 2025, and I'm excited to see what else we will see throughout this year. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Have you tried out any of these handhelds and which one is your favorite, or are you playing something from a previous year? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.